this is my angle, is that I am a tiny home builder. I built a tiny home for myself. It really, really changed my life because it really enabled me to kind of take a step away from kind of the financial traps that leave people kind of treading water within their space. So it really, really worked for me in particular. And I don't see it as sacrifice. It's a trade-off, and there is moderation in your life.
What if solving the West Coast housing crisis didn't mean building bigger, but living smarter? Welcome to Pacific Time, the podcast where we explore West Coast challenges, opportunities, and the prospect for greater autonomy. I'm Greg Ammerfell, and I love talking with the innovators and big personalities who are literally reframing our biggest challenges. In this episode, I talk with Zack Giffin, professional skier, builder, and co-host of Tiny House Nation on Netflix and YouTube. We're talking about why America's obsession with size has left millions priced out of the housing market. From his days as a ski bum living in a rebuilt RV to becoming one of the country's foremost advocates for small-scale living, Zack argues that our housing shortage is really an efficiency problem. We explore why regulations make it easier to build a McMansion than a modest home, how building codes are decades out of step with today's realities, and how a few wheels under a well-designed 400-square-foot home could unlock new possibilities for affordability, family support, and climate resilience. Stay tuned for a conversation that might make you rethink what enough looks like and why the West Coast could lead the way toward a more balanced housing future. Zack jumped in by describing the West Coast housing crisis.
There's a lot of aspects to the housing crisis, right? You know, one of the things that I like to remind people of when we're talking about the housing crisis is that at the same time as there's this massive housing shortage, and when you talk to economists, they'll put that number at something like 4 to 5 million homes nationally. We also have the largest amount of square footage per person than we ever have before. And so that's a little bit backwards because it means that our houses have been getting bigger and the number of people that are occupying these homes have been getting smaller. So really the housing shortage in my mind is more of a product of that our population has started to use our existing housing stock less and less efficiently. And so when we're talking about tiny homes, which, you know, I always do, it's kind of coming back into that conversation of efficiency. And I think that there's ways that you can, you know, create a space, whether that's your own home or any space, and kind of maximize the functionality, the value, and the performance that you get out of that space. I think that there's a conversation to be had about how we can do that with our cities and utilizing the existing housing stock more efficiently, in my mind, is the most direct method to address our housing shortage versus then, you know, looking at the problem as something that we have to solve by just keeping building more and more homes, which I'm also a fan of, but I think it's got to be, you know, on two fronts.
Got it. So to put it another way, it's not just the number of units that are getting built, it's about their size and efficiency in order to meet the unmet demand for housing.
Yeah, and the one issue that I take with a lot of economists when they talk about the housing shortage is that very few people ever talk about what types of homes are in short supply, right? Because they just say, hey, we need more homes. But when you look at, you know, what has been built over the last, you know, 4 decades, you know, and where our housing stock is kind of in high supply, it's basically in the larger, more expensive homes that they are not necessarily going to solve the affordability crisis. Where we have a real huge deficiency is the smaller, more affordable, what used to be called starter homes. And I'm partially to blame for this. I spent most of my, you know, 20s in Colorado, and, you know, we would remodel homes, mostly kind of starter homes, and we would take them and we'd double the size and make cherry trim, and, you know, all of a sudden it's not a starter home. So at the same time that we stopped building smaller housing types that are more affordable, we also took the ones that we had and systematically, you know, doubled the size and kind of turn them into a much more expensive housing option. And so that's really what I see. I see there's kind of a lack in the conversation of that specificity about what type of homes are actually in short supply. And when I look at it, I see that, you know, it really is the smaller, more affordable housing options. And it's to the point where we kind of have this dysfunctional housing ladder, if you will. Real estate people like to talk about, the housing spectrum as if it's a ladder where you can kind of climb rung up, you can get into what you can afford, you can save up, you can get a better house. And, before you know it, you're living in your dream home. And, what I see is a housing ladder where we have some very dramatic rungs missing. So it ends up trapping people in a place because going from, an apartment into a single family home is such a huge gap that there's just like such a divide essentially. And so, what I advocate for is the inclusion of a more variation of housing types to act as stepping stones for our population to go up and down the housing ladder.
So, Zach, you observe that there's sort of distortion in the market because economists and policymakers just looking at the quantity of housing, and that what builders are delivering tends to be high-end housing. Why is that?
Well, because we've kind of divided our housing market into kind of high end and apartments, right? There's like very little construction of anything in between those. And there's nothing wrong with apartment buildings and apartment living, but it's not a solution that's going to really make sense for everywhere. And what I'm meaning is more kind of rural areas or less dense, not really urban centers. You get into a position where, like, number one, maybe a big apartment building is going to look out of place. But number two, it might not necessarily be, reasonable because there is quite a bit of available land. And so there's no like really need for people to concentrate so much. And I think that there's an argument for a lot of people that says, hey, I would much rather live in a small, tiny house in someone's backyard, and have that outdoor space and have that privacy, not necessarily have to share a wall, than I would be in an apartment. Right. And I think, I live personally in a small condo right now, and I love it. It's not my dream. One of the things that makes it work is that we don't really have neighbors around. Like, our neighbors kind of come like very infrequently. And so, it's a very understandable thing. And I think that one of the reasons that people have not been building smaller homes is that the way that we have created our building codes, as well as the way that we zone land, means that the numbers really just don't work out, right? That it's far more profitable for a developer to kind of take a property and then maximize the square footage of that home, because the return on the investment is just so much greater. And I think that that is a really big problem that, until we kind of grapple with it a little bit, I don't see the shortage of kind of like more economically focused housing types as kind of going away. So, the thing, and just for clarification, it's not that easy, because as soon as you're saying that something is both building codes and zoning codes, it means that you have to take two different approaches and you got to solve them both before it's actually going to work, if that makes sense. The way it works in our system is, if it's not really a housing type that is described within the existing building codes, it's very difficult for a municipality to zone for it, because you're essentially asking the municipality to kind of green light a housing type that hasn't gone through the traditional methods of vetting and health and safety and, everything else that goes through with writing building codes. And so it's a little bit of a liability thing, but it's also just asking municipalities to do something they're not very comfortable or accustomed to, even though it is within their power.
Yeah, so you've anticipated my question, which is kind of what's standing in the way of more housing types that are different than apartment on one hand and high-end single family home on the other, which is, so what are those barriers? And you're highlighting that it's the complexities of both zoning codes multiplied by the complexities of building codes. But places are making progress. So what have been the unlocks in areas where they've been able to find and develop new kinds of housing?
The unlocks have been on two fronts. On the zoning side, it's really just essentially relaxing regulations to allow properties to kind of upzone, if you will. The whole conversation around the missing middle is a really good example of that. Then on the building code side of it, I would bring into the conversation things like offsite modular construction. right? And 3D printed homes, all of these kind of new technologies that are really poised to really make a big difference in terms of the cost of our homes and our ability to kind of meet that demand that economists are citing as the root cause of the issue. Factory construction is absolutely one of the methods that we are going to be able to employ to reduce the cost of homes, right? And so that can be done with tiny homes where you're putting out units that are just ready to place. It can also be done in the modular capacity where you're, building sections of a home that are going to get into site and then, get erected. But the problem is that the way that we vet new technologies for housing construction, it's really arduous and it takes a really, really long time. That's part of the reason, like, a lot of people have heard about a company called Boxable, right? That got really popular and had a huge amount of investment that got put into the company. Well, what the people that were investing in the company didn't realize is that the housing type that they had, that they're saying, hey, here's our boxable home, that wasn't in compliance with the building codes, right? And they had to go through a whole series of process in order to kind of get treated as a viable housing type. And it takes years and years and years, and it's not guaranteed. And so that's kind of where we are. Me, I think of myself as a housing advocate. I'm going to advocate for any type of home that is in short supply that I think can, like, really, be a solution for people in our society. Because I'm just coming from the tiny house world. That's kind of where my audience is, and that's kind of the housing type that I champion first and foremost, right? But it's not, kind of everything that I will do, but I'm as much of an advocate for these introductions of more technology into the process in ways that are really going to be able to kind of reduce not just like the cost of homes, the way that we think about it, but the actual price that the actual cost that it takes to construct homes. So that's what I think about it. What I'm looking at first is like, yeah, we can do a lot of things on the financing side to make homes more affordable, but that's different than kind of impacting the underlying fundamentals of what is, making these homes more expensive to construct.
Yeah, and hey, I think what you're saying, and we'll come to tiny homes in a minute. There's a lot to talk about around that type of housing in particular. A lot of fun stuff to talk about, but I think what you're saying is, look, zoning and building codes, while they're always challenges, they were rooted in some good intentions. Building codes, for example, probably made the case for insulation to make sure that energy wasn't bleeding out and air wasn't bleeding out the house. Well, what could have applied in a 2,000 plus square foot single family home may not be as necessary to attend to when you're talking about something that's half that size or smaller, right?
Well, yeah, that's where, my involvement in building codes really comes from is coming from the tiny house world and recognizing that a lot of the rules have been put in place with homes that are, a very much larger structure that's really kind of a whole different animal when it comes to kind of the safety concerns of, how you construct something like that, as well as, the efficiency issues. Whereas tiny homes, they're very, very simple structures. They're typically one story. They are under 400 square feet, and it doesn't mean that they're not, like, a challenge to construct, but it just means that, like, there is a difference between a tiny home and a real home, and getting the ICC, which is the international body that writes the guidelines for the building codes, to kind of acknowledge that was a really big challenge. And in 2016, I was kind of part of a group of people that went to the conference and petitioned for something called Appendix Q that was actually accepted. And it's essentially just that. It's an acknowledgement that tiny homes are different. And in order to be able to build a tiny home, you really need some exemptions from some of the standards that are you know projected onto other housing types. It's very nominal things in Appendix Q. It's like, things like the width of a staircase. You can have a skinnier staircase. You still need a handrail, but it can be steeper. And this is all just in kind of acknowledgement that, like, when you are talking about a tiny home, a staircase isn't going more than, you know, 7, 8 feet at the max, right? And so there's a difference. There's an inherent safety difference when you're talking about a 7-foot drop versus a undetermined length of staircase where someone could fall a really long ways. And, what we are doing currently now with the building codes is essentially just saying, okay, well, Appendix Q was great, but it did nothing for the most popular type of tiny home that there is, which is the tiny homes on wheels, right? So we had good success. We got some things implemented, but it's been back to the drawing board and really another decade of effort spent trying to petition the ICC to take a look at like, hey, uh, can't you build a home on a movable chassis? From my perspective, the building codes are about, and I think that this is within their statement, is about health and safety and efficiency, right? And so when the building codes are going beyond things that are, justifiable for the grounds of health and safety and efficiency, then we're kind of moving into an era where we're needlessly kind of raising the cost of our homes, which ultimately is going to impact somebody's ability to get into a home. Our housing crisis has come so far where historically our regulations have only been going one direction. Every single cycle, they get a little bit more stringent and a little bit more stringent. It gets a little more expensive, a little bit more expensive. And over decades, it's just kind of this drip, drip, drip of regulation that has gotten us to this point where our housing is being built incredibly well. We are incredibly safe, but it's costing so much that a whole segment of our population can't get into a home at all. Right? Where it's costing so much that when we start to look at solving the problem, the amount of money that it takes per unit to build kind of affordable housing means that it's this seemingly unattainable process to actually solve the problem, build enough. And that the only way that we're going to be able to provide homes for a certain segment of our population is by subsidizing their cost. And so those are things that like we have to grapple with. And, if you want to know, why homes are too expensive, well, it has to do with this drip, drip of regulation. And it also has to do a drip, drip of tighter and tighter zoning policies combined with more and more stringent environmental oversight and safeguards combined with higher utility dues and your impact fees and whatnot and your permitting costs, like all of that over the time is drip, drip, drip. It's gotten more and more expensive. And so, we're at this place where I think a big piece of the activism really needs to be taking an earnest look at what those policies are about. And if there's ways that we can kind of, rationally pull back from some of that without jeopardizing health and safety, I think it's really time to do that. And tiny homes specifically, because they're so much smaller, there's so much of the building code that's kind of in place. And I'm not going to say so much, but there's elements of the building code that are just really excessive for the demands of tiny homes. And I'd love to talk about what those areas are.
I really appreciate that perspective. In fact, just before we were talking, I was reading an article by Derek Thompson, who with Ezra Klein wrote the book Abundance, and they really focused attention on the housing shortage as an issue that, liberal places in particular need to overcome. Thompson today was writing about one of the untold narratives in the political divide, which is on one side, you've got a lot of people who are anxious, and on the other side, you've got a lot of people who are angry. And I think your point is, stress is influencing both of those groups. And so if there are ways for us to like systematically lower the temperature and address base level needs, housing being, one of the first things we talk about, a roof over our heads, we can lower the temperature.
So yeah, I hear a lot of people talk about like the cost of living. And what I want to really say is that we really need to kind of focus our attention more on the housing aspect, because number one, housing is such a big, chunk of most people's budget. And the poorer you get in this country, the larger a chunk of your money you're spending on your housing. And so, it's this really big aspect. And if you can impact that big chunk, you're going to make a big difference in people's lives. And it's also, as opposed to some of these other aspects of cost of living, where you're talking about, commodities that are kind of affected on a global scale, housing is the one element that our policies have direct implications on, right? And have impact. So we are kind of doing it to ourselves. And it's a self-imposed shortage of housing because of the policies that we put in place. And I think when you look at, the work of Ezra Klein with abundance, he's pointing out things that I've been saying for a long time. And what I have to say about Ezra's work is yes, I'm in 100% in support of this. I do think that Democrats in particular do need to kind of take a hard look at this. What I was saying before, the way that the regulations have drip, drip, drip to a point where we might be in territory where some of them are excessive, right? And how does that impact, something that is so fundamental like housing, right? So, but the thing that I will add as a caveat to my support of Ezra's work is that the issues that I take with him is that he does fall into the same category, kind of. I mean, he kind of gets a little bit more descriptive, but he does fall into the same category of just saying, hey, we need X amount more homes. And he doesn't start talking about what, those homes are. I would like him to get into that more because I believe that actually we are way overbuilt on, 5-bedroom homes and above, even really 4 to 5 bedroom homes. We have way more than we possibly could use in this country.
So we've been tiptoeing, Zach, around the prospect of tiny homes. Let's talk about tiny homes. What are they? How do you define a tiny home compared to other types of housing?
Okay. Well, let me segue into tiny homes here with my criticisms of Ezra. My only issue with what Ezra is doing is he's not delineating what types of homes are in short supply. And there's another aspect to what he promotes, which is this kind of dismissal of what he calls the politics of sacrifice. This notion that changing the way our behavior will reduce our consumption is any, meaningful significance, right? And he kind of challenges that the politics of sacrifice is a losing proposition for people. And I will back him up on that. However, I think he's thinking about it wrong. I think about it as the politics of moderation, right? And when I look at tiny homes, right? So this is my angle, is that I am a tiny home builder. I built a tiny home for myself. It really, really changed my life because it really enabled me to kind of take a step away from kind of the financial traps that leave people kind of treading water within their space, right? So it really, really worked for me in particular. And I don't see it as sacrifice. It's a trade-off, and there is moderation in your life. But the whole point of a tiny house is trying to kind of scale down on the things that are excess and hold on to the things that are important and essential so that you don't have true sacrifice, right? That's the whole mentality of it. And by the time that you're living in something that is so small or so constrained or missing things that make you happy, that's not the point. I try to stay away from the square footage delineation on what a tiny home is and just more talk about it in terms of a spirit of moderation and a spirit of just kind of being open with taking a look at what are the essential items in your homes, what are the essential amount of square footage you need for yourself and your family. And that's going to change for everybody. But the whole movement, it's not about just building tiny homes and being really excited because they're cute. It's just kind of a portion of the population that are kind of have taken a look at the direction that the American housing, stock has gone, and just the process of what that American dream that involves the big house and all of the debt and everything else does to your life, and are saying, hey, no, we're going to step in a different direction. And I think about it as just bringing more balance back to the culture. So it's not about sacrifice, it's about moderation. And that's my only point.
And it's interesting. I find analogies for that in lots of other areas. I mean, yes, in the United States, we kind of have this notion of the big 4 or 5 bedroom house and the picket fence and the big yard and all the things that go with that. They're both the trappings in a good way, the barbecue in the backyard and that stuff, but it also the debt and the cost of the utilities and all the things that go into it. And yet, in other worlds like technology, if the original iPhone had been so laden with every possible feature of every computer and every phone device, it would have been this massive thing that no one would have wanted to hold up to their face or put in their pocket. And so Steve Jobs gets credit for elegant design as opposed to moderate design, right? And zeroing in on the things that are truly most important and doing those exceptionally well and making that elegance an object of desire as opposed to something repellent. It's not brutalist, it's not slimmed down, it's elegant. So those could be some words to play with as this discussion about moderation continues.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, look at just, different styles throughout history, right? I mean, it goes in a pendulum swing, right? Pants get really, really baggy and then they get really, really skinny and then they kind of get a little bit more in the middle and then, they get back to baggy and it fluctuates because that's the nature of nature is, right? Trying to find that equilibrium a little bit. And that's why you have, architectural like Art Deco, where it's just every inch of the entire interior is just like, taken up with tchotchke and, not, but it's, and then you go to a different, a couple decades later and it's the modern, Scandinavian minimalism that is like taking over the what's in and hip and cool. And
So I want to come back to talking about places that are doing this well, but let's just start at a high level. We've been mentioning tiny homes. Zach, could you define what a tiny home is and how it compares to other forms of housing?
so a tiny home by definition in the building codes now is a home of 400 square feet or less. And in my definition, it can be built on or off a movable chassis. So it can be on wheels, it could be on foundation. The reality is that the space needs to be maximized for functionality, in my mind, to be a tiny house. And the truth of the matter is that the really tiny homes are almost entirely on wheels. And the reason is because of the rules of the road. You have that incentive to keep things really small so that they're more portable, but also you can't go above, 13 and a half feet without a permit. You have to keep it under a certain weight or you need a CDL. These type of things lend incentive for homes to get really small. And so the really small tiny homes that we think of as like true tiny homes, they almost all are being built on wheels. And it's, from a developer standpoint or just even a homeowner's, it's like, by the time that you invest the amount of money into getting the permits, paying for all the prep and the site prep and the foundation and connecting to utilities, like the overall cost of the project is significant enough that like expanding the square footage of the space a little bit isn't going to change the overall price tag that much, if that makes sense. So it kind of like removes a lot of the incentive that people have to go really small. So that's why, yeah, there are tiny homes on foundations, but, for the most part, when I talk about a tiny home, I'm typically talking about one that's on wheels. And partly because, before tiny homes on wheels came along, we had tiny homes on foundations. We just called them cabins. It wasn't, we had other names or like bungalows or this and that. It wasn't like a brand new thing. It wasn't until somebody put like a really well built custom home, like little custom cabin and put it on wheels that people identified like, wow, that's something different. Like that needs its own name. And it wasn't a trailer because we already have a definition in our mind for trailers. So it needed a new name. And that's why tiny house came out.
So under 400 square feet, often on wheels. For people who've never stepped foot in a tiny home, what would you expect in a classic design?
So what you're going to find by and large, almost universally, is that you're going to walk into a tiny house and you're going to say, whoa, this is way bigger than I expected. Right. And the reason for that is because there's like certain tricks of design that really, really change the way that you interact with a space. Open floor plans where you can see long ways, throughout the space. High ceilings is another really good one. But the other thing that people don't expect is kind of like all the utilities, right? You're used to kind of going into trailers and seeing these kind of like really, diminished kitchens with kind of like RV appliances and whatnot. And you go into a tiny house and it really like jumps at you when you like see a kitchen that looks like it belongs in kind of any American home. That's what I'll say about a tiny home in terms of like, they are very small, But the reality is with like good design and then also just the aesthetics and the headroom, they really become a very livable space. And when I say livable, I'm talking about, it depends how many people you got in.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I think that's worth noting. I mean, I feel like the ones I've stepped into, it's a little bit surprising. There's always a separate bedroom. It may not have a door that closes. It might be a loft, or it might be kind of in the back of the house. But there's usually like a full kitchen and even a living space. And that would find furniture. You'd find a bed. You'd find a couch. You'd find appliances in the kitchen. And so yeah, it feels functionally almost surprising that there's that much living to be done in the space.
I think about it more of like a scientific exploration. And I think it actually has real relevance in terms of being like a green technology, because the reality is like our housing represents a really big portion of the human carbon footprint. And so anything that we can develop and that makes a home that's smaller function at a higher level so that people can like happily live in smaller spaces and have it not be what we were talking about before, a sacrifice, right? More of a trade-off, then, this is a real important thing for humanity to explore, right? It's just, I'm not going to say tiny homes are the future, but doing more with the resources that we have is absolutely the future, right? And that goes on all levels. That's like, more efficient engines for gasoline. That's moving off of, moving to renewable energy sources, but it's also just figuring out how we can use less energy. And so when I am kind of building new solutions for a kitchen that like means that you can kind of also fit a dining table, I'm like thinking, actually, this is me engaging in a very needed experiment or endeavor of trying to figure out more solutions.
Zach, what are a couple fun examples of the experimentation you've done? The fun parts of making things fit in a tiny space.
So in Tiny House Nation, we went 84 episodes. It was 6 seasons. And each episode, I was responsible for like 3 projects. And I always thought of it as like one really big hang my hat project that I'm really proud of. That's like a true creation. One project that was a little bit more tied to the storyline because it's kind of TV. You gotta do that, keep the producers happy. And then one project that it was kind of like a DIY project where I'd try to get the homeowner to be more involved. But the one project that I would hang my hat on was always one that I really, really like put myself into. And it was always, something that was, I wouldn't do it if I had seen somebody else do it. So they're all like prototypes, new creations. And along the way, every once in a while you get, you're building prototypes, but sometimes you stumble upon a prototype that like literally it's like you get done and there's like no notes. And when there's no notes to me, and it's like if I was going to build it a second time, there's almost very little I could refine. Those are the projects that I kind of like stick out in my mind of like, that was a good design, right? So there's a table that I just built in a tiny house. We're shooting a new TV show for YouTube called Tiny House Revival. It's going to be launching in November. And there's already 5 episodes shot. We're running through this. It's really, really fun. And this table was basically, it was essentially a bar top. So it's flat against the wall. One section was about 5 feet. And then there's another section that's about just under 3 feet. And then there's a flap that folds off the end of that, right? And so the 2 sections, the short section and the flap are connected with hinges. And then the long section and the other 2 are connected with a hinge in the back. And both sections are on carts. And the corner of one of the sections is tied to the wall. So it follows a little track, kind of like a barn door hardware, right? And what you do is, it converts to a table, and all you have to do is you pull where the crack is, where the 2 come together, and that brings it out. And so it basically goes back to back and gets double wide for a table. So it's like, which isn't a big deal, but then the flap comes up, which actually makes the length of it and ties it back to the wall. And I'm telling you, it is super simple. It requires really, I think, like 6 parts, like 3 slabs of wood, 2 carts that have wheels, and then like a track, and then a couple hinges, and that's it. And it's this great solution. And I'm totally going to be making plans for this and trying to at least offer them. I do that with a lot of my projects. So that's the one that's on my mind.
I can see and hear your smile. You seem to really enjoy what you're doing. For whom do tiny homes work really, really well?
I believe, tiny homes, they're not it's not a silver bullet that's going to solve the housing crisis. But if there's one thing that we can do that's actually going to have a real impact, tiny homes is it. And the reason for it is that basically it fills that demand that is really the most critical need right now is for smaller homes that are designed for singles, right? But also homes that are just on the lower end of the housing spectrum that still are dignified, are quality, can provide joy for the occupant, but also are at a price point that people can get into them. The other aspect about tiny homes is that our neighborhoods are built up, right? Our cities are basically zoned the way they are, and the space is occupied. But if you're a tiny house, there's a lot of little cracks in that space where you can basically use these housing types to fill. So as a tool for us to infill, and kind of create higher density within our urban or suburban areas that also preserves a certain degree of kind of, I would call, harmony, right? It's much less disruptive, but it does it in a way that doesn't upend kind of the feel of these neighborhoods. And so it's a very gentle method of upzoning. And I guess the last thing I'll say about it is that the whole thing that makes it work is the wheels.
Why? What about wheels make it work?
I'm glad you asked that. And the reason is that because the wheels mean that you can divide the ownership, right? As soon as a tiny house or an ADU is on a foundation in a backyard, you essentially have to have one property owner of that space, right? If it's on wheels, what can happen is I can buy a tiny house. You can own a home with a backyard. You can rent out your backyard to me who owns the tiny home. And that means that you don't have to have nearly as much investment into producing that rental, right? You can simply run utilities to a pad in the backyard, maybe $5,000 investment. And then I'm the one that gets to, come in and I get to enjoy the dignity that comes with owning my own home, right? Also, you don't have to worry as the landlord about me ruining your space because I'm just renting the backyard. And what it does is it creates this very sustainable relationship opportunity.
So, Zach, what are places on the West Coast that are doing really incredible work and exemplify kind of a receptivity and welcoming of tiny homes or tiny homes and wheels?
So most of the progress, ironically, has kind of come from California. And I say ironically just because I think of, California as basically the birthplace of the modern housing crisis, right? It's like the canary in the coal mine. But it's not actually that surprising that they would be a little bit ahead on kind of trying to find solutions because their situation is so extreme. And so Fresno, California basically was the very first place to write an ordinance that allowed tiny homes on wheels to be used as accessory dwelling units. And the way they did it was they based it off of the RV code. So there's two different RV codes. There's the regular RV code and there's what's called the park model code. And so the park model code is just a little bit more stringent. And so they basically took the park model code and said, hey, if you're building recreational vehicles to this code, and then you are also incorporating certain elements that we require that are coming from residential construction, right? Like they need a certain pitch on the roof. There's, they need, residential windows and doors, these kind of elements, right? Then you are looked at as a movable tiny house and you are exempt from basically the prohibitions on living in RVs. So it's an RV, but it's also considered a tiny house. And that therefore it's basically viewed as, sufficient for health and safety. And you can live in it beyond the 180-day threshold, which is projected on all recreational vehicles, essentially.
And I'm hearing that lots of cities on the West Coast are moving at some pace, maybe not fast, but moving to do more to invite accessory dwelling units, which I think is probably a good sign that they're moving toward tiny homes and tiny homes on wheels. I mean, one stat that I came across, and I don't know that I haven't confirmed this yet, but if there are 3 million houses short in California, there's about 400,000 houses getting built every year in California. Now up to about 20% of those are accessory dwelling units. So it's still tiny relative to the overall need, 80, 90,000 units, but it's coming on really fast. And it definitely, as you say, it's not the silver bullet, but it's going to be an impactful part of the range of solutions.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm a big fan of ADUs. I really love the way how ADUs kind of, like I said, it's a big house with a small house next to it. The problem with ADU laws, the way that they're currently written, is when you follow them, they basically have a very disappointing level of impact on the affordability of the space, right? And the reason is that, like, typically about only 20% of them end up making it onto the rental market, right? The vast majority are built as kind of a guest home or a space for a relative, which is fine, but it doesn't, those spaces, because they don't get into the open market on the rental market, aren't considered extra volume, so it's not going to impact the cost. And so what it really means is that ADUs are great, but they're not having a really big impact on affordability. And furthermore, what you're doing is you're taking a home that, the property may have cost $500,000. Now you're putting a $200,000 ADU in the back, and now you got a $600,000 or $700,000 property. So you've basically just, in the name of affordability, you've come in and you've made the property that much more expensive and that much harder for people of less affluence to even like think about starting to ownership. And so if you do that to all the properties, imagine what happens. You just took that rung on the ladder and made it that much higher. But I'm not against accessory dwelling units. I just think that is the dynamic that I speak to when I say that the wheels make such a difference, right? Because what it does is it takes the ADU laws and turns it from being really this great opportunity for somebody who's already affluent enough to like own a home and then be able to afford another construction loan to build an ADU, right? That's a great policy if you can do that. But if you are somebody, say you're an older homeowner on a fixed income and you have your house, but you don't have any spare money for, more food, let alone an ADU, like it's not really an option for you. And so for that reason, enabling it to be on wheels means that that person with the property, for very little upfront investment, could just simply open their backyard to somebody who owns a tiny house. They could start creating like a consistent income that could be meaningful in their lives. It could really help people age in place, and just take the stress away. And you're also providing a space for somebody who otherwise wouldn't be able to have one, right?
Zach, tell us the story of how you got into tiny homes to begin with.
Okay, well, my feeling about how I got into tiny homes started way before I ever saw a tiny home, because I was a skier and I was kind of like in the category of a ski bum. So I was a bit of a dirtbag. I was always just looking for just a simple, dignified place to live that kept me near the ski slopes and was affordable, meaning I was basically free. Um, And as a skier, you're in these environments where you're going to resort towns typically. You're trying to be by these places that are kind of filled with tourist destinations. So it's been, housing has been a big issue in those places for a long time. It's a bit of like a canary in the coal mine. And so like the ski community is certainly adapted around, people sharing places and, just a variety of different methods. So for me, it was like I've started out when I moved to Mount Baker, I bought an RV, and it was, an old RV, and I redid the inside. I put, wood floors and cabinets and redid the roof. And it was really nice on the inside, but it was definitely like a zombie RV from the outdoors. And so, I got to feel firsthand that sense of like, okay, this is a cool structure, but hey, if people don't really like aren't comfortable with you being around, then that's a problem. If the neighbors want to like, pull up and then ask you how long this like ugly RV is going to be parked outside, It just causes all sorts of problems. So then I experimented with a van, which was definitely much more under the radar. And for me, it worked a lot better. I wasn't necessarily living there, but it was like a little bit of like a safety net. That's what these places always were for me. It was like a safety net, because when you're living in a world where you're prioritizing experience and like this passion and this dream. For me, it was skiing and trying to be a professional skier. You're kind of sacrificing a lot of other aspects of life, savings and all the rest. And so, for me, it was just this tool to kind of facilitate my life, to enable me to kind of follow through with that, like pushing as hard as I could towards those dreams. And then when I finally saw a tiny house, it was like my dad's friend kind of turned me onto it, and I took one look at them and I was like, oh my God, that is kind of everything that I've been looking for, kind of in this really like adorable package. It just was like light bulb moment for me. And I said, hey, that's legal. Are you kidding me? That's legal. I'm definitely doing that. So within a couple of months, I'd built my first tiny house. And so that's basically how I got into it. And I was a skier, so I also did it in collaboration with my ski sponsor, who's a kind of a awesome local company called Outdoor Research. That process was a big piece of me kind of turned on to specifically what we call tiny homes. The idea of like living in a minimalist capacity and using, homes on wheels to kind of facilitate the flexibility of a life like that was something that I was not a stranger to.
Yeah, it's crossed my mind that the mentality that connects people who are drawn to tiny homes must be similar to people who are drawn to van life and, the sort of sprinter van phenomenon. The idea that kind of getting by with less is more, and how to kind of like find exactly the right gear and the right configuration and the right furniture and setup to just get by with something that's super minimal. It sounds like that you lived that for a long time.
Yeah, that's right. And, and that's why, in a lot of ways, tiny homes are nothing new, and the exploration on like how to survive in a small space, that's nothing new either. For me, it was like a van had been great, but it was obviously very limited. And one of those limitations is kind of the amount of time that you can comfortably spend in the van, versus a tiny home just gives you that much more kind of luxury when you're occupying the space. And I think for both of those categories, like what makes it all work and what made it work for me and a lot of other people is that most of my life was outside my house, right? My house was very much this place where I would come back to sleep and, to eat and just like have that kind of privacy in that home base. But it wasn't like I'm, planning on spending just like hours and hours inside the space, because I was, out and about, whether it was for work or for play. My life was outdoors. So.
You've had Tiny Home Nation on YouTube and then on Netflix. I think you said 84 episodes. What was that journey like? And what have you learned through the process of, drawing so many people to the idea of tiny homes?
Well, so for me, Tiny House Nation came about just, kind of randomly. I was, had a friend who was working a bit in television send me a casting call email and said, hey, sounds like they're looking for you. And so I thought, hey, that sounds like a wild adventure. And in the description, it was kind of like describing me in, particular. It was like, must be able to speak the language of construction and have experience with carpentry, and then also be between these ages, and then also be, comfortable with production. And because I had been working in skiing, it's very different, but it's definitely working with cameras and working with photographers. And so I kind of checked all the boxes and ended up somehow getting hired on the show. We were very much not the originators of tiny homes, right? But, we have been somewhat credited with kind of taking the movement, which was a little bit more niche, and kind of putting it on a platform that was really being seen by a much wider audience. And so kind of definitely felt some responsibility in that myself, in that I was very much I was a believer in everything that the movement stood by, and our need to kind of showcase it in a very positive way, right? Felt some responsibility myself as being like a messenger that would be kind of bringing this through in a way that people would react positively to it, right? Because that's what we needed. And so I think, one of the things that I'm proud of is I think we did a good job of that. I think myself being someone that was very bit of a geek about it and definitely within the weeds. And then my partner, John, being somebody who can, make it more receptible to the wider general audience who, might need some translation on some of the stuff. And so there was a good partnership there. And it's been, a fantastic privilege because, television, especially reality TV, I think is not something that most people feel like is number one, is like really bringing, a lot of value into society or the world, right? It's just kind of, it's entertainment and that's amazing. But a lot of it is just kind of terrible people acting terribly sort of thing. And so, to be kind of put in a position where, hey, this is a really cool opportunity, like being on television's fun, it wasn't paying me great, but it was more than I had been accustomed to. And it was very, very creatively fulfilling for me because the job was so challenging week after week after week without almost taking any breaths. You have to keep creating, keep creating, keep creating. And fantastic, just training ground to like exercise that muscle for me. And then at the same time, it's really promoting something that I just totally believe in and think has, real potential to bring some balance, like I said, back to this world and particularly impact some of the challenges that seem most kind of unsolvable for us, housing being at the particular. But, in my mind, I read further into it than a lot of people do. And I see the way that it impacts just dynamics within our society and like even, our ability to create environments that generate upward mobility. So really, fostering the American dream, I see it as really kind of one of the tools that we can use to make some gains in this battle to kind of reduce our carbon footprint and, live in a more sustainable way. I see it having impacts on even just cultural relations, and our ability to kind of impact the historic segregation that has been really something that has just been hard to find solutions for. So I see it as this thing that potentially impacts society in all of these different ways. And so I think it's just been that combination. I have to say it's been very gratifying to be a part of it and leaves me highly motivated to keep talking about it.
This show is about what if questions, Zach. So, what are the what ifs we might ask that could really unlock the tiny home movement?
Well, what if we just allowed them to be used as backyards? What if we allowed lots instead of putting a 5-bedroom home? What if you could put 5 tiny homes on it, and then you could have people, making the choice to say, hey, like maybe that's something that I want to like partner with 5 friends and share a property. What if we didn't have mandatory minimum building laws, that force people to kind of build over 1,000 square feet? And what if we allowed properties to be subdivided a little smaller? Are these things that are going to drastically impact society in a negative way? What if we did this? What's the consequence? And what's the consequence if we don't? What's the consequence if we allow the housing crisis to continue to do what it's doing, right? What's the impact on our industry, on our capacity to be competitive in the world when our housing is just crushing people's pocketbooks and, you know, basically what I believe is really kind of removing the power of the American dream that was the bedrock of kind of all the privilege that we enjoy now. What if we don't solve our housing crisis, right? How is our society, our country going to keep being shining leaders in innovation and all the other things that we're proud of as Americans, right?
Well, and where I go with it is, what if more people watched Tiny Home Nation or your new show, and were compelled to step foot in a really well designed and well built tiny home? What if more homeowners saw that, had the same experience, and said, "Yeah, I want to build one or two of those in my backyard"? Could this movement sort of gather its own momentum that pushes it ahead of the state of building codes and zoning and other regulation?
Yeah, yeah, and like I said, I'm very much in favor of building codes and regulations. I just want them to be reasonable. And I don't think that they are right now, because I don't think that they've been written with the issues that society is trying to tackle with right now. These building codes are coming from a time, other than increases in the energy code, are coming from a time where like the concerns and, issues that we're facing just weren't nearly as present or nearly as critical. And so, we just haven't really adjusted. They're outdated in my mind. And the process to change them takes too long. So the last thing I will say is that I think one of the what ifs, which is like, if we don't handle the housing crisis, if we don't start getting a handle on like cost of living, especially in democratically held cities, right? I think that part of that what if is already playing out, right? There's already this desperate need for change that's been, kind of understood, but has been brewing for long enough that every single election process happens to be about change. And it's come to the point where, people were ready to elect Donald Trump, because even if they didn't align with him as somebody that shared their values or policies, they just understood that like he was ready to disrupt some stuff. And so I think part of the thing of the what if that, I was trying to say is like, what if we don't do this? Well, that's already starting to play out. We're already starting to see part of the what if you don't tackle these issues, like I said, and have reasonable regulations that are defendable based upon like ensuring health and safety, then this is part of what happens is like people start looking for other options. And a lot of times they don't necessarily choose the best one. But I would like the people that are kind of within the power structure, especially when it comes to housing, because I think it impacts so much of our society, to kind of understand that like we need to get a handle on this if we want to be trusted with the keys to power, because it's, people are desperate. So we need some change.
Zack Giffin, ski bum turned housing advocate and media personality, reminds us that housing isn't just about shelter. It's about freedom, stability, and the dignity of having a place to call your own. The mythology of the American dream recognizes this, but that worthy aspiration has gotten uncomfortably bloated, like a bad sleep after an indulgent meal. For too long, our rules have rewarded size over sense, creating a housing system that's unaffordable, unsustainable, and out of balance. We just have too much square footage for too few people. So what if solving the West Coast housing crisis isn't about subdivisions and McMansions? What if we built smaller, shared more, and rediscovered the joy of living within our means without giving up comfort? What if we gained creativity and connection in the process? What if, in inviting tiny homes to play a much bigger role in our housing mix, we put aside the stigma of sacrifice and start celebrating the merits of moderation? What if the West Coast dream of abundance, of widespread prosperity, was a bit more accessible, and going small wasn't about settling for less? Tiny homes aren't a cute made-for-TV gimmick. They're a reminder that we can live better by living lighter. Thanks for being with me in Pacific Time. If this episode inspired you, please share it with the single people you know, the campers, the elders preparing to downsize, anyone who's thinking about buying their first house. And please join the conversation on YouTube and Instagram at Pacific Time Podcast. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.